and understand that this underlying source of suffering and happiness is within our own mind. And then, of course, we'll start to work with our mind to eliminate those causes of suffering and to cultivate the causes of happiness. And we'll have that aspiration then to be liberated from suffering, knowing and understanding that the sources of happiness and suffering is within our own mind. And so that second insight into dukkha or suffering will lead to us to this aspiration called renunciation, the aspiration for liberation from suffering. And then the third distorted view, the one we're now going to look at in a little bit more detail, is seeing a self where there is no self, grasping to self. And of course here, when we say no self, we're not saying no me, no person. That would be nihilism. No self, or self, means an overinflated false sense of me. And that grasping to self, here at the foundation level, is said to be the root mental affliction. The underlying cause of all other mental afflictions and suffering. So if we come to realize there is no self here, then we can overcome mental afflictions and suffering and achieve liberation, this goal called nirvana. And so we'll very shortly now have a look at what do we mean by self? And what is this grasping to self? What does it look like? But very briefly, the fourth distorted view that we have, that we're going to look at starting next session, is seeing things which are dependent as independent. Again, I think instinctively we have this sense there is an independent me here and an independent objective world there. And the Buddhist assertion is this is a distorted view. And at the deepest level, this grasping to independent me, independent world is the root of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. And so here then we need to come to realise there's no independent me, no independent world. Of course, this is this insight into emptiness that we're going to begin to look at starting in the next session. But before that, let's have a look at this word self and what does it mean, because I think there's a lot of confusion here often. So the question is, does self exist or not? And the answer is, it depends on how you use the word self. Sometimes the word self is used simply to mean self versus others, meaning person. So of course, if we're using the word self just to mean self and other, then of course that exists. But here, in the context of Vipashyana, when we see the word self, normally that's not how we're using the word. And there are at least three ways in the word, the way in which this word is used here. One is self as in terms of a unchanging, unitary and independent person. Unitary, of course, just means a single thing with no parts. And we often see this way of describing self in Buddhist literature because at the time of the Buddha, there were a number of traditions who were saying the self actually existed like this, that the self was something unchanging, it was a single thing, and it was completely independent of everything else. And of course, the Buddha refuted this. And of course, if we look at this, this is not really normally something that we instinctively have, this false sense of me, because this we could only really get through a wrong intellectual way of thinking. Because if the self was unchanging, it couldn't really do anything. And if it was independent, it would mean here that we could have a sense of me somewhere over there, because it would be completely independent of the body and the mind. And we never have a sense of me that's not somehow related to some aspect of the body and the mind. But it's mentioned because, again, a number of traditions at the time of the Buddha were saying exactly that self exists that way. There are the two other ways that we do, in fact, instinctively have a sense of self. The first of those, and that's the one we're going to be looking at now in the Vipashyana practice, is a sense of autonomous self. What this means is that now we have a sense that there's a me here somewhere, and this me that seems to be here seems to be something a little bit more than just the body and the mind. There seems to be something extra on top of the body and the mind, me. And we have that in our language. We say, I have a body, I have a mind. As if there's a me here that has a body and has a mind. So it seems like there's three things here: body, mind, and me. And that me really seems to be autonomous, meaning it seems to stand apart a little bit from the body and mind. But it's not somewhere over there. It's somewhere mixed in, but it has some autonomy. Stands apart a little bit. And the technical term for this in the text is is a self that is self-sufficient and self-substantially existent. Self-sufficient means it seems to not really rely on anything else to exist, and substantially existence means very solid and real. And so this is the self that we're going to be looking for now in the Vipashyana practice we're about to do. And it's this grasping to self that, in the Four Noble Truths, is said to be the root cause of all of our problems. So if we realise there's no such self, we can overcome mental afflictions and suffering. And even here, sometimes we have this thought, we sort of look at our body, we don't really like what we see, and we may have this thought, I'd like to swap this body for a younger, more healthy, more beautiful body. Sometimes we have these thoughts. And then sometimes we look at our mind and it's a bit of a mess and we go, I'd really like to swap this mind for a more intelligent, more kind, less neurotic mind. But where is the me that could do this swap? Because if we take away this body and mind, what's left over? Is there a me there? Is there a me there that is sort of like the master and controller of this body and mind? Instinctively, it seems like that. Instinctively, it seems like there's a me here running the show, or trying to run the show, trying to relax this body, trying to train this mind. So it really does seem like there is this autonomous me here And that's sometimes the word that's used in the text, this idea of a me that is like the master or controller of the body and the mind. And we do, I think, instinctively have this sense of me. But is there such a me there? That's what we're going to be looking at now. But before we go to that, I'd just like to briefly mention the fourth one, which we're going to look at in the next session. And that is the idea that there's an inherently existent me here, a me that exists from its own side. Whereas this is a sense that there's a me in addition to the body and the mind, something extra. This is the idea that the me is the body and the mind, that it exists there from its own side. And this is what we're going to start to look at in the next session. But for now, we're just going to be looking for this. Is there such a self here to be seen? Any questions about that?
I didn't understand the second independent. Why is it there?
Because this would mean independent of body and mind. So you could have the body and the mind here, and you could have the me there, because it's independent. It's not related. It's not depending on the body and mind at all. That would be what that would imply. Which, of course, I don't think we ever have a sense of me over there somewhere. It's always in relationship to the body and the mind. And also, being unitary, this word independent would also imply independent of causes and conditions, which, again, I think we don't have that sense of me. You do?
Yes. When I studied Vipashyana, I used to think so, and ever since then, I have the feeling that Ligoma that was here yesterday is here now and will be tomorrow, not changing. I have the feeling that there is a Ligoma which, when you flatter or when you hurt, there's something solid, unchanged, unitary that is hurt or happy, and totally independent, not over there, but the feeling is that nothing affects me except conditions at all, but there's the solid aura is there.
And that's this one. That's this one.
That's the okay.
That's this one, because that's what solid means. Solid means substantially existent. Self-sufficient means not really relying on anything else, but it's here.
Also, I have to refute the feeling that there is a boss controlling the play, which is the autonomous. Maybe I'm the only one that I'm not beyond a Vipashyana.
Right. But I think we have to understand what that means and what this means. And so I think what you've described is really more like this, because substantial means something really solid and real here, and self-sufficient meaning it's there, it's not really depending on those things that it's there. So the difference between these two is really, this would imply a sense of me.
And that's the only case? That's the only case to describe independent?
No, but I'm just saying, because also here we can use the word independent. But the word independent here means something a little bit different, that's all. Yeah, I mean, we could, in fact, here, we can use the word independent, but that's a little bit different than the word is used here. That's all.
Is it more like character related?
Character related. Which, this one?
Number 2.
Character. Well, again, the assertion is that this would be a false sense of me that we would get through some wrong way of intellectually thinking about me. We could come to the conclusion that the me is really this. That's how we exist. It's not normally something instinctive.
Can you please explain the last one?
Well, that's next session. Right? That's coming.
Related to the session just before about the sense of happiness. So how we could think or feel any happiness, anything that to do with happiness, but also not happy. So that's it. It's not several bursts and bursts of gratitude, but
Right.
most of the time I have not happy, nor this happy.
Right. So remember, this meditation we just did is to come to an insight into dukkha, which is the human condition. And so by doing this practice, we can come to really see that the happiness is not out there, the suffering's not there. There's just pleasant, unpleasant arising. And that at a deeper level, we can see that our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. That's at the deeper level. We weren't really going that way in that meditation. But that would be the deepest insight there. So thereby really coming to realise what condition do we really find ourselves in now. So that's what we're trying to do in that meditation. And so therefore, yes, there's no happiness there, but there's the source of suffering is also not there. So good?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and apparently what you were saying, because we say that the mind is neutral. It's not, it's clear knowing, but it's neutral. And then when you were saying, look for a source of happiness, I was like, yeah, if I add love to it and compassion to it, then I felt like my heart, is expanded, and that's happiness. I mean, this is what, for me, that was something a little bit more clear regarding that, because it does go according to reality and how things are, and it's something that you can bring, and then you are more happy.
Yeah, I mean, then you
I
can...
do edit, because it's not there naturally, right? Because the nature of the mind is clear, knowing, and is neutral. But you can add those things to it, which is in accordance with reality, and then that makes you more happy, I think.
Well, again, yes. I mean, if you have that experience of love or compassion, is that coming from outside?
No, from me.
So then that's going to help us to realise maybe the source of happiness is not there, but here.
Yeah.
Good. Good.
Again, to the impermanence meditation here from yesterday, and number 2 of the unchanging. Just trying to solve this, trying to understand it a little bit better. Because from how I see it, if I want to view change, there has to be a point where I know that is unchanging, that I view from this point, or at least I need to know that how this point is changing to know to compare to the change that I see. For example, if I'm watching the view and I'm not moving, so I can say if the view is changing or not. But if I'm moving, then the view will seem as if changing.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So that again here, we need to understand what we mean by change. So, in fact, without change, things can't function. Because doing an observation is change. So you couldn't observe if there's no change. Because if you're an unchanging agent, then how could an experience ever arise? It couldn't. Because there's no change. You could never observe anything.
But
You could never have anything arising because that's change.
If you are the only one who changed.
No? I mean, if an experience arises in the mind, Isn't the mind changing?
Yeah, but
So how can you have...
because you've
How can
used
you experience
a
anything?
specific point that is unchanging.
Yeah, but you couldn't...
Like not the mind itself that is unchanging, but some point, some unchanging self, in a way.
So you're having an unchanging self, and how is that related to the changing mind?
It's like let's say, the eye that is watching. Like,
Maybe the stillness?
Right, but does that... So that self is completely unrelated to the mind. Because the mind is changing, but the self is not.
there is some relation, but
There is a relation. So does that I have the mind, possess the mind?
I don't know.
So you don't have a mind.
I don't know the entire.
So we're not, see, we want to be careful we're not turning this into some philosophical discussion. We're talking about our lived experience.
Yeah, but
I mean, we can philosophize about all sorts of things, but what we're talking about is how do we see ourselves experientially?
But that's the feeling I got a little bit from the meditation. Like from watching all the change, it felt like there is some point that I'm watching that is unchanging to view all of this.
But isn't your act of observation, isn't that change?
The object that I'm observing is changed,
Right.
but the point that I'm observing from felt like it's unchanged.
Right, so therefore we need to look at that closely, and that's what we're going to do, starting a little bit now and later. Again, superficially, it seems like there is a very autonomous agent here, inherently existent thing there. But is that the case? That's what we need to do. And that's the thing is that superficially, that's how often things seem. You know, if I just look here, it seems like there's a cup there that's not really changing. Is that really the case? That's what we need to investigate. So if you have that sense that there is somehow this same agent there behind everything, then we need to look for that. And that's what we're going to do in this practice a little bit and come in. So exactly this is the practice, to investigate that very closely. Of course, we can intellectualize all day long, but is that going to help? I mean, we may come up with some really smart answers, but is that going to change anything? I don't think so. We need to see what's there. And if we have a certain experience, let's see, is that reality, or am I having, is it a delusion? Check. We need to look closely, and that's what we're doing here.
I have also a question very related to him. I thought to myself if the space is changing, like if I'm, emerging with the space, not I. If there is a space, is it changing?
Look.
In the beginning I thought it's not, but now I can see its influence from the things that are changing.
I mean, the answers to all these questions is through observation. I mean, we can intellectualize all day long and convince ourselves it's like this or like this, but...
In my experience, it was like space, and in this space, it was moving, stuff are moving, but the space is kavua, like it's stable.
Well, then we look closely and investigate. Is that really the case? That's what we need to do with all of these things, you know, not just accept how it sort of superficially looks, because now things superficially look in a lot of different ways, but the Buddha's assertion is that that's not really how they exist, so we need to look closely.
And this is the space also.
So we need to look closely.
This space here, outside.
We need to look closely, yeah. Then we need to do the meditation, yeah.
Let's say I want to use Vipashyana to explore my emotions.
Right.
Let's say something happens and I react, and I react, it feels negative, it feels bad, and I want to explore it. I want to know, go down the rabbit hole, see what comes up.
Yeah. That's what one of the things we're going to look at this afternoon, this evening and tomorrow, so that's still to come. We're sort of working towards that. So let's do that practice now. So we're just going to, again, use the classic approach of body, feelings, mind, phenomena, but again, we'll put feelings in the mind category. So we're just going to look in the body, the mind and phenomena, and see if there's a self there. So let's do that practice. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Simply becoming aware of the sensations of the breath.